Granblue Fantasy Relink has completely taken over my gaming time over the last few weeks. The weird part is that I didn't expect this game to hook me at all. I knew almost nothing about the Granblue universe. The story didn't immediately grab me, and when I first started playing, I honestly thought it was going to be just another decent action RPG that I'd finish and move on from. Instead, I'm sitting here approaching the end game, constantly telling myself just one more quest and finding excuses to try new characters, chase new upgrades, and fight increasingly more difficult bosses. So, what happened? Why has this game managed to grab my attention when so many other RPGs fail to hold it? After spending dozens of hours with Granblue Fantasy Relink, I think I finally figured it out. When I first started playing Granblue, I really didn't expect it to hook me so much. It looked like a somewhat interesting anime style game, heavily focused on the combat. I didn't expect to get into the story really, but I didn't actually have any idea about the progression systems, which is really what actually hooked me. And I'll definitely start talking about that later on in this video. I kind of expected I would just play through the story once, maybe not even get through it all, maybe enjoy the combat for a bit and then just move on to the next game. But what actually ended up happening in the end was that I was intensely hooked on the progression mechanics, extremely interested in trying the different characters and the different play styles that each character has, leveling them up, trying to build them up and make them strong, and come up with the best team possible to tackle some of the hardest bosses in the game. That's really where I had the most fun, was trying to think, okay, what AI teammates do I want on my team to support my main character, and what main character do I enjoy playing the most, so that I can put together an awesome team that is interesting and fun to play with and also capable of beating some of the harder bosses in the game. On top of that, I just really enjoyed the progression system with the different masteries that you level up your characters with, the different weapons that you can equip them with and level up those weapons as well, chasing specific sigils to support the build that you're going with. And again, just fighting the bosses is really the most fun part about the game, is the actual combat and the team building aspect to it. So I'm going to talk about that in today's video. Again, I do want to stress that for me specifically, and probably many other people out there, the story and the story missions really wasn't the best part about this game. And in fact, I think that it could have some people checking out before they even get to the end game, which is a little bit unfortunate. That's not to say that nobody's going to enjoy the story. Apparently, it was a pretty successful anime, and it seems to continue off of that. And there are people that do enjoy the story. So if that's you, then that's fantastic, because the game should be even more fun for you to play. For me specifically, what I really wanted to do was just get through the story so I can get to the end game and really start progressing, because I find the game really hampers your progression during the actual story chapters. There's not very many places you can go to grind for experience, to get mastery points, and to really start building your team out until after you finish the story. Then it really starts to kick into gear, and that's where the fun is for me. One of the biggest reasons I've been hooked on Granblue Fantasy Relink is the combat. Now, on the surface, the combat looks a lot like other action RPGs. You have normal attacks, skills, dodges, flashy special abilities, things like that. But once I started actually playing, I realized there was a lot more in depth here than what I expected. The first thing that stood out to me was how responsive everything feels. Attacks have weight, abilities feel impactful, and when you land a big combo or a skybound art, it feels satisfying almost every single time. What really surprised me, though, is that the combat never started feeling repetitive. A lot of action RPGs are fun for the first few hours, but eventually every fight starts to feel the same. Granblue managed to avoid that for me. Even in sections of the game where you are literally grinding the same boss over and over, it always felt fun, and it always felt like you were working towards that next big upgrade. Part of that comes from the boss fights, which we'll talk about later, but a big part of it comes from the character design. Every character has their own mechanics, strengths, weaknesses, and playstyles. When I switched from Zeta to Eugen, it felt like I was learning an entirely different game. The same thing happened when I started experimenting with characters like Vasaraga and Fairy. Instead of finding one character and sticking with them forever, I constantly found myself wanting to try somebody new just to see how they played. And I think that's one of the reasons why the combat has stayed fresh for so long. Also, something that is generally recommended against by the Granblue community. When you start branching out and trying all these different characters, you're limiting the growth of your stronger characters and spreading your resources a little bit thin. So you want to be careful about that type of approach. But I've always been that kind of player. I like trying new characters. I like trying a whole bunch of different things that the game has to offer. So I obviously went that route with this game. Speaking about trying different characters, let's talk about that next. One thing I really wasn't expecting when I started Granblue Fantasy Relink was just how different all the characters would actually feel. A lot of action RPGs have large rosters, but once you actually start playing them, many of the characters end up feeling like slightly different versions of the same thing. Granblue is not like that at all. When I first started playing, I spent most of my time on Zeta. Her gameplay revolves around timing, aerial combos, and staying aggressive. After a while, I became comfortable with her playstyle and figured I had a pretty good understanding of how the game worked. I liked her because she felt kind of like a Dragoon from the Final Fantasy series. But then I tried Eugen. Suddenly, I wasn't flying around the battlefield anymore. I was hanging back, aiming shots, managing grenades, and playing what felt like an entirely different game. Later on, I started experimenting with characters like Vasaraga, who is much slower and more deliberate, but hits like a truck if you learn how to use them properly. What surprised me is that every time I unlocked a new character, I genuinely wanted to try them. Not because I needed to, but because I was curious about how they played. That curiosity ended up becoming a huge part of the experience for me. Every new character felt like a new toy to experiment with, and it constantly gave me a reason to keep coming back. And while the combat and character variety are a huge part of why I enjoy Granblue, I don't think they're the main reason I've become so addicted to it. I think the real reason is the progression system. If I had to point to one reason why Granblue Fantasy Relink has been so hard for me to put down, it's the progression system. The combat is fantastic and the character variety helps keep things fresh, but progression is what keeps pulling me back for one more mission. What I love about Granblue is that there's almost always something you're working towards. Maybe you're upgrading a weapon. Maybe you're earning mastery points. Maybe you're looking for a better sigil. Maybe you're unlocking a new character. Maybe you're trying to improve an overmastery roll. Whatever stage of the game you're in, there's usually another goal waiting for you just around the corner. One thing that surprised me is how much this reminded me of some of the gacha games I've been invested in over the years. Now, to be clear, Granblue Fantasy Relink is not a gacha game. It's a full, premium game with no energy systems, no daily login requirements, and no pressure to spend money. But it absolutely captures that same feeling of constant progression. You're always making your account a little stronger. Your favorite character gets a new weapon upgrade. You unlock another mastery node. You finally get a sigil that you've been chasing. Maybe you roll a better overmastery bonus than the one you're currently using. None of these upgrades are game changing on their own, but together they create a constant sense of momentum. And I think that's what makes the game so addictive. Every time I finish a quest, I feel like I've made progress towards something. Whether I finally got the materials I needed for a weapon upgrade, or earned enough mastery points to unlock another section of a character's tree, or found that specific sigil I've been looking for, the game is constantly rewarding your time. And because of that, it's incredibly easy to sit down for what you think will be 30 minutes and suddenly realize you've been playing for 3 hours. What I find especially impressive is that all of these progression systems work together. The mastery systems make your character stronger, the weapon system gives you long-term goals, sigils let you customize your build, and overmasteries give you another layer of optimization once you're invested in the character. None of these systems are particularly revolutionary on their own, but together they create one of the most satisfying progression loops I've played in a long time. And once that progression loop gets its hooks into you, it's very difficult to stop playing. Another thing that's kept me hooked on Granblue Fantasy Relink is the boss fights. A lot of action RPGs have decent combat against normal enemies, but then the bosses end up feeling like giant health bars with a few extra attacks. Granblue's bosses feel much more like actual encounters that you're expected to learn and overcome. Early in the game, they're fairly straightforward, but as you move through the different difficulties, the bosses become more demanding. Attacks become more dangerous, mechanics become more important, and eventually you can't just mash buttons and hope everything works out. One mechanic I really like is the overdrive and break system. As a fight progresses, bosses will eventually enter an overdrive state where they become more aggressive and dangerous. Your goal is to push through that phase and eventually force them into a break state where they're vulnerable, and you have an opportunity to deal a huge amount of damage. One mistake people might make early on when a boss enters the overdrive state is to think that you have to back off and wait for the boss to kind of run out this state, but it's actually the opposite. You need to find ways to get damage in on the boss even when it is in overdrive state so that you can bring down that meter all the way down until it enters its break state, and then you get to turn the tide on the boss and dump a whole bunch of damage into them while they're broken. It creates these really satisfying moments where the entire fight shifts momentum. Instead of just attacking constantly, you're paying attention to what phase the boss is in and looking for opportunities to capitalize when they're vulnerable. The game also does a great job making the bosses feel like spectacles. Giant attacks, screen filling mechanics, skybound arts going off everywhere, link attacks chaining together, and four characters all trying to bring down something much larger than themselves. Some of my favorite moments in the game have come from boss fights where everything finally comes together. The combat feels great, your character build is starting to take shape, and you're working through mechanics that seemed overwhelming the first time you saw them. One of the most satisfying feelings in the entire game is coming back to a boss that gave you trouble earlier. Maybe you barely beat it the first time or even failed the quest completely. Then you spend some time improving your weapons, upgrading masteries, finding better sigils, and learning your character a bit more. When you come back later, you suddenly realize you're breaking the boss faster, surviving attacks more easily, and dealing significantly more damage than before. It's a simple thing, but it creates a really tangible sense of growth. The game isn't just telling you that your character is stronger, it's showing you through encounters that used to feel impossible and now feel manageable. For me, that's where the combat and progression systems really come together, and it's a huge reason why I keep coming back for more. As much as I've enjoyed Granblue Fantasy Relink, I don't think it's a perfect game, and there are definitely a few things that potential players should be aware of. For me, the biggest issue isn't actually the story itself. I think the story is perfectly fine for what it is. The problem is that some of the story missions can feel like they drag on a little too long compared to the quest-based structure that makes up the rest of the game. The other thing that surprised me is how many of the progression systems are locked behind story completion. During the campaign, you're upgrading your characters and learning the basics, but a lot of the systems that eventually became my favorite parts of the game don't really open up until you finish the story and start working through the higher difficulties. In some ways, it feels like the game takes a while to reveal what it actually is. Then there's the grind. Now, personally, I don't mind grinding when the gameplay is fun, and Granblue's combat is fun enough that I usually don't mind running the same content multiple times. But once you get deep into the endgame, there is no denying that the game expects a significant time investment if you want to fully optimize your characters. That becomes even more noticeable if you're like me and enjoy experimenting with lots of different characters. Every new character means more weapons to upgrade, more masteries to unlock, more sigils to farm, and more resources to collect. The Terminus weapon grind is probably the best example of this. These are some of the strongest weapons in the game, but acquiring them can take a very long time, especially if you've unlocked a large roster of characters. In some ways, the system almost encourages you to focus on a small group of favorites instead of constantly branching out and trying everybody. I've also had very little luck with multiplayer matchmaking so far. Granblue was designed with multiplayer in mind, but during my playthrough, I was rarely able to find active groups for the content I was running. Hopefully, the upcoming DLC and renewed player interest will help improve that situation. I've also seen some players criticize the endgame balance and RNG systems. Between sigils, overmasteries, and rare drops, there can be moments where progression starts to feel more dependent on luck rather than skill. None of these issues were enough to stop me from playing, but I do think they're worth mentioning because they may bother some players more than they bothered me. If you've made it this far and you're thinking about trying Granblue Fantasy Relink for yourself, there are a few things I wish I knew when I started. The first is not to judge the game too early. Some of my favorite systems didn't fully open up until after I had finished the story and started moving into the higher difficulties. If the game feels a little simple at first, stick with it. In a lot of ways, I don't think Granblue fully reveals what makes it special until you're well into the postgame. Another piece of advice is not to over-optimize the fun out of the game. If you look at things purely from an efficiency standpoint, it's probably smarter to pick your 4 favorite characters right away and focus all of your resources on them. That's going to make progression easier and reduce the amount of grinding you'll need to do later. But personally, some of my favorite moments came from trying new characters. Every time I unlocked someone new, I wanted to see how they played, and because the roster is so diverse, I rarely felt like I wasted my time. If you're the type of player who enjoys experimenting, don't be afraid to do it. It might not be optimal, but games are supposed to be fun. Another thing worth knowing is that progression walls are completely normal. There were several points where I felt like a boss or a quest was significantly harder than everything that had come before it. Sometimes the best thing you can do is throw on a movie, a YouTube video, or a stream on your second monitor and spend some time grinding materials, mastery points, and upgrades. I spent a fair amount of time running the Slime Pete quest to build up mastery points for my team, and those upgrades made a huge difference. Eventually, you'll come back to that difficult boss and realize you're doing more damage, surviving longer, and breaking them much faster than before. Those moments are incredibly satisfying and are one of the reasons I enjoyed the progression so much. And finally, don't rush to the end game. A huge part of what made Granblue enjoyable for me was gradually learning the systems, experimenting with characters, and watching my team become stronger over time. The destination is great, but a lot of the fun comes from the journey. At the end of the day, Granblue Fantasy Relink isn't a perfect game. It has some pacing issues, the grind won't be for everyone, and there are definitely areas where I'd like to see improvements. But despite all of that, it's become one of the easiest games for me to recommend. The combat is fantastic, the characters are genuinely fun to learn, the boss fights are memorable, and the progression system has kept me coming back long after I thought I'd be finished with it. If you've been on the fence about trying Granblue Fantasy Relink, I think it's absolutely worth a look. And if there are any other games you've become unexpectedly addicted to recently, let me know in the comments. I'm always looking for interesting games that might be worth checking out. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more discussions about games that are worth your time, consider subscribing to the channel and liking this video. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.